Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. In my decades as a political reporter, I had a rule that I would clean up slightly because we're on TV. When two people called each other names, I agreed with both of them, so long as they told me. I was only in it for the conflict. There were so many incidents of name-calling between Governor Andrew Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio that I would be a happy and busy reporter, probably making lots of overtime if papers still paid overtime. Just in recent months, they have directly or through their subordinates sniped at each other over mass transit, public housing, child welfare funding, legal reform, including closing Rikers Island, ethics, property taxes, school funding, and the relative fiscal standing of Albany and City Hall. The two Democrats haven't agreed on much, with the possible exception of a potential ban on plastic grocery bags and possibly the arrest of a Daily News reporter. Aside from the entertainment values, there are serious implications for the city's ability to provide services to its 8.5 million people. We've said it before, but it's worth repeating, that the state has immense power over city affairs, where City Hall cannot in many cases set its tax rates, controls its pension system, or even install red light cameras without permission from Albany. In the recently passed state budget, the governor pushed through provisions for an outside monitor to oversee long overdue repairs at NYCHA housing projects and a breathtaking usurpation of local land use control with a takeover of development plans around Penn Station. Hanging over the fractured relationship is the third New Yorker not in the room, who sits in the White House overseeing a one-party federal government decidedly unsympathetic to Donald Trump's hometown. Nowhere is that more evident than in the recently passed federal tax overhaul, than in its limitations on deductibility of state and local taxes, was laser focused on robbing from higher tax states like New York and New Jersey in order to pay lower tax states that helped elect him. And of course, this is an election year for the governor and the state legislature, which, depending on how you look at it, gives Albany an incentive to ignore New York City's requests for help, or gives the mayor leverage to torture Albany counterparts who need votes. The governor's plans to cruise to re-election find him being challenged from the left by actress and education activist Cynthia Nixon, who has harped on Albany corruption trials and mass transit woes at the MTA. And you may see Syracuse Mayor Stephanie Miner getting in the race, former Syracuse mayor. De Blasio, of course, is term limited, having just finished his last mayoral run, and no longer has to face voters unless they are from Iowa in the 2020 Democratic presidential caucuses, where he may run into Andrew Cuomo, seeking those same votes. They both may run into Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, but that is a story for another day. We're joined by four New Yorkers with varied perspectives on the current relationship between the state and the city, and the governor and the mayor, and what it means in the real world. Nicole Jelinas is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor at the City Journal. Michael Aronson is a member of the editorial board of the Daily News. Basil Smikle is a distinguished lecturer in politics and public policy at the Murphy Institute and a former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. And David Birdsell is the dean of the Austin Mark School of Public and International Affairs at CUNY's Baruch College. David, let me start with you. There are real-world implications of the fight between the mayor and the governor. Have you ever seen anything quite at this level?
Well, there has been a long history of sniping between governors and mayors. This is a particularly acute conflict in some respects, and it's a very one-sided conflict. As you pointed out in your opening remarks, the governor has many more tools than the mayor, and this is a mayor who just insists on leading with his chin, bearding the governor in places where he's really not likely to get a lot of traction, including perhaps having some role in prompting the Cynthia Nixon campaign in the primary. Whether he can win any of these fights remains very much to be seen. That last one is the only option he's got on the table at this stage, but it does make it very difficult to set city policy and try to figure out exactly what's going to happen before the governor, as he has now so many times over the last 4 years, swept in precisely to do in a larger scale what the mayor had promised to do himself in slightly different ways.
Basil, you've looked at this for many years. You were the executive director of the party. How would you have put up with this? And and you also have in Albany now, the governor is kind of saying, I'm the new progressive. He's forced the marriage between the mainline Democrats in the state Senate and the independent Democratic conference. And people, and you have the Cynthia Nixon challenge saying, "I don't believe you."
Yeah, it is interesting, and owing to your point earlier, governors win, right, because of the way things are structured. But it is interesting because there was concern and question about whether or not the governor would get a strong challenge from the left in a post-Bernie Sanders environment. And I think the reunification of the Democrats in the state Senate is probably a huge component of that.
After the budget done,
After the budget's done.
and after they receive
That's
their
right.
Lulus from the state.
Now it remains to be seen whether ideologically they come back, and it remains to be seen how long it'll last. But it takes a talking point off the table for him, and I think with respect to Cynthia Nixon and others, whoever else, if it's Stephanie Miner that might actually come in, there are a lot of New Yorkers that believe that he's been able to promote some very progressive policies, starting with marriage equality at the beginning of his tenure as governor. So I don't know where they sort of fit in terms of pulling him more to the left. I don't know to what extent that they'll be able to do that. But I do think that what consistently may hurt him is this sniping, because there are a lot of New Yorkers that are looking at that and saying, I just want to get something done, whether it's NYCHA, whether it's the MTA, we just want something done to fix these problems. And if they can't blame anyone, they'll blame everyone.
Michael, you all have been very tough on the mayor, on the city housing authority. I grew up in Linden houses. I take that personally. And do you think you've had a role in pushing the governor, who has not spent a lot of time in housing projects until the last 2 months?
Oh, I think he was happy to show up these past few weeks. Every time he did, the word would go out that he was coming, and the crews would come in and clean up all the mess and the garbage at that development. So maybe that's one way to get it all cleaned up. Just visit each one in turn. Right. The public housing thing, Cuomo makes the argument, it is owned by the city, managed by the city, but funded by the federal government. He said the state has no role except to come in and make trouble or whatever he's trying to do there and take jabs at de Blasio. I don't think he wants to take over the backlog of $25 billion in repairs to the housing stock for 400,000 people. But if he's happy to come in and say, de Blasio is doing a lousy job, he's a bad landlord, he's a slumlord. So and he has teamed up with the Council of Presidents of the residents, who are now in court suing de Blasio, saying you didn't do what you're supposed to do on lead paint, you didn't do it on mold,
on boilers,
on keeping us warm. I think they estimated 300,000 people were cold at some point this winter, and that's all goes on de Blasio. I think Cuomo likes picking on de Blasio. He seems to enjoy it. De Blasio seems less into the fighting and kind of responds when he, feels cornered. But it's maybe just in Cuomo's nature to be combative with this. He's known de Blasio for 30 years. When he was a HUD secretary, de Blasio was his man in New York. And Cuomo dismisses de Blasio as political, and de Blasio dismisses Cuomo as political. They're both right and they're both wrong. I don't know if the fighting with de Blasio is going to help or hurt in a gubernatorial primary. Cynthia Nixon clearly is getting encouragement from those forces allied to de Blasio.
But Cynthia Nixon, to a degree, this is a race between Cuomo and not Cuomo, just the way Zephyr Teachout 4 years ago was not Cuomo.
And 4 years ago it was Zephyr Teachout, and she got 35%. So Nixon could say, well, I'll start with 35, because Zephyr Teachout had zero name recognition before, and maybe I can get it up to 40 or 45. And she's, hitting him on, I'm doing small donations like Bernie Sanders did, and Cuomo takes his donations in $50,000 chunks. I think he'll probably prevail in the end, but it's going to tax him. Fortunately for him, the Republicans don't seem to have anyone of a real caliber so far running. So he's going to slog through this even today. We were taping this on a Wednesday. She came out and said, we have to legalize marijuana in New York. And so everyone ran to Cuomo, what do you think? So he had to respond to her. Even though he would like to ignore her, he would like not to say her name, he's going to have to deal with the fact that she's likely going to be on the ballot and facing each other. Ironically, on Thursday, thank you, Albany, September 13th. So a day that no one's going to go vote on a Thursday in September.
September 11th is a Jewish holiday, if I remember. Plus, it's September 11th, if I'm.
Right. So they can find a Tuesday, but they don't want to find a Tuesday, so we're all going to vote on a Thursday. Thank you. Thank you, Albany. Excuse, not thank you, Bob.
Nicole, NYCHA is not the only major authority that's been focused on. I mean, probably more focus has been on the MTA, and the governor kind of forced the mayor to pony up $480 million to match what the state is throwing in. And you have the kind of beginnings of a congestion pricing plan. How do you look at this? I mean, you've spent a lot of time looking at MTA funding.
Well, I would argue that Cynthia Nixon isn't even running on the left of Cuomo. If she were, she wouldn't be that much of a problem for him because there's just not very many voters who want to go too far to the left of Cuomo. People want a higher minimum wage, but they're worried about how high it should be and when does it start to affect job creation. The other progressive issues are either settled or they remain unsettled for good reasons like that. She's really running on competence, and she's going out there, taking the subway to these meetings, making the point that she's getting late to these meetings because of subway breakdowns, and saying the governor has had 8 years to run the MTA, and yet delays are.
Of course, the governor says that the city owns the transit system,
right,
which is quite disingenuous.
And the delays are at a record level. And here, the governor's response to this over the past year has been the city has to put up funding for the MTA. And this is an absurd argument. The MTA's own bond documents say the MTA is responsible for the subway system's capital plan, and all of the money comes from the city anyway, whether it's billed as a state tax, like the payroll tax that brings in close to $2 billion a year for the MTA. That's collected by the state, but it is levied mostly on city residents. 74% comes from the city. All of the MTA's taxes are like that. If you live in the city, you work in the city, you're visiting the city, you're paying for the MTA. So this whole argument has just been a distraction, and I think it hasn't worked very well, to the extent that more than a few voters are paying attention. They know that the governor is in charge, and it's a real risk that this becomes a protest vote to peel off some more of those voters, in addition to the people who voted for Zephyr Teachout 4 years ago.
So jumping, by the way, I mean, the institutional, I mean, you have a political fight, but you have institutional implications. We're talking about NYCHA, we're talking about the MTA, and the governor's land grab, frankly. And, even though the land grab, as Michael has explained to me, is not quite as grotesque as I thought it was. But I mean, this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of where institutions start affecting people's lives.
Well, institutions have enormous impact on people's lives, and we have to remember that there is declining trust in institutions overall throughout the United States and in every Western democracy at this point. Part of the reason is delivery issues like the problems with the subway. But the subway has been described as the vascular system of the city. That's absolutely right. Can you imagine trying to get to work in the morning without the subway, having to rely on private automobiles, whether self-driving or not, if we look 20 years down the road? And it's just a perilous concept. And we have to remember that the city is the economic engine for the state. So trying to pit state interests against city interests is deeply detrimental in terms of the long-term policy trajectory of what we see. I'm still skeptical, though, that Cynthia Nixon is going to be able to capitalize on these discontents.
That's where Mayor Minor of Syracuse might be a more potent challenge.
A practiced policy professional, a very successful mayor in Syracuse, who cultivated quite a cult following among policy wonks in the academic community while she was serving as mayor. So I think that would be in many respects a more credible candidacy. Serious name recognition problems, but is it enough to say no Cuomo. A lot of people like him. He has 66% approval rating right now. It's not naturally something that's going to get traction out of the gate. And what is Cynthia Nixon going to do about the subways? At some point, somebody's going to ask where that rubber hits the roll or the steel hits the rail, and how is she going to make that better? She's got to make that case as well, unless she can stoke so much animosity about the governor's failed stewardship.
I think he'd be happy to have both of them run.
Yes.
Better to have, you know,
Yeah.
two opponents, both women. You know, they can split the protest vote, and he'll go with what he would think the bulk of support. The MTA, actually, the subway is actually owned by the city, and has always been owned by the city. Every platform, every tile, every car, every inch of rail is owned by the city of New York. But since 1953, it has been operated by the Transit Authority, which is now controlled by the state. So this is, you know, Cuomo says the city owns it. Yeah, but you're supposed to run it. And there's no dispute there. And Cuomo says, well, you know, I'm the manager, he's the landlord. But we have decided that the manager is going to be the state. And there's this crazy set of formulas with the MTA voting, so the governor does not have absolute control. And this is all set up purposely so you can't pin it on one political player. Because you say, well, it's not entirely me, it's that guy over there or that woman behind the tree. So Cuomo did, in the end, get what he wanted from the city administration on the MTA. I mean,
On the extra funding.
on the extra funding. And you're right, every dollar comes from New York City, whether it's taxes or fares or anything else. The person in Buffalo is paying basically zero for the New York City subway system. You know, it's 1/1,000,000th of a cent on their proportion of direct state aid, which is tiny, and it gets, so it's funded by the people who live here, by the people who ride the trains. And then Cuomo says, if I collect it, I'm responsible for paying it. And de Blasio, it's all baloney. What we all agree on is that the trains stink and they're not working. And that's what, you know, Nixon's saying. She's saying Cuomo's MTA, showing up late, happily, you know, why am I late? Andrew Cuomo. You don't want to be late? Get rid of Andrew Cuomo. I don't know what her plan for the subway is. Probably just get rid of Andrew Cuomo. It's going to make the trains go any better. What happened in Albany is we didn't find out until the next day what had actually passed. There was another land grab that I think you wrote about also, this value capture idea.
Very
that
important.
the MTA could say, New York City, we're going to build a Second Avenue subway, and we're going to take all the property taxes for within a mile of the Second Avenue subway.
The increase in property taxes because of the increased value of the property, because it has the subway. That's
whatever they want to
the
do it.
theory.
They ever wanted to do it. Right. And it was such a ridiculous attempt. And then Cuomo said, no, I'm doing it with their full okay. And the city said, no, this is not with our okay. In the end, it didn't happen. Even though Cuomo had his people up there to the last minute, walking the halls of legislature, trying to pressure and lobby individual members to support it, they said, get out of here. It didn't happen. That would have been a disaster because it would have allowed the MTA to just come in and start claiming city property taxes that we need for cops, fire, schools,
And
parks,
Nicole, they
roads.
would have kept that money for time immemorial going forward. Isn't that what the plan was?
Sure, and it all comes back to the fact that these are not separate revenues that go to separate things. The MTA is one entity. It gets the majority of money that it spends from the city, but over the period of reinvestment in the transit system over the past 40 years, the majority of the money for expansion programs has gone to projects that don't so much benefit city subway riders. East Side Access to bring the Long Island Railroad underneath Grand Central Station this is an $11 billion project, but it doesn't help anyone who rides the subway. You look at the third track on the Long Island Railroad, which Cuomo is doing now, very valuable project, but it doesn't help the subway. And so you have city subway riders subsidizing these huge commuter rail projects, and if you then add a new property tax diversion to send to the MTA, the governor would say, this money comes from the city, it's going to fund city projects. Well, okay, but what about all of the other money that comes from the city that continues to be not prioritized properly by the MTA in terms of helping the most people get around more efficiently? And we should have been concentrating on subway signals, other projects that benefit hundreds of thousands of people rather than a few tens of thousands of people who come in from Long Island. And there's an unfairness in that the city was expected to pay this extra property tax levy, but the state didn't go to Long Island and go in the corridor where the people will take the Long Island Railroad and get to Grand Central and benefit from that enormously. The governor never said we're going to have a property tax levy in the Long Island corridor on developers who want to build taller apartment buildings within walking distance of the train. If you did both of those things together, this might be, with some big modifications, at least an agreeable, rational plan. But as it was designed, it was just another tax grab from the city without thinking of the region as one region and what do we do to benefit the region.
This is not the only thing that didn't happen. From my perspective, one of the most important things that didn't happen is a lot of the criminal justice reform issues, bail, the end of cash bail, a lot of the steps towards the closing of Rikers Island. The ending of cash bail is linked to the decrease of the jail population, which will lessen the need to keep Rikers on. There's a lot of issues that didn't happen, perhaps because of the Republican/IDC control of the state Senate, or because it's very convenient to be able to blame the Republican IDC control of the state Senate.
I also wanted to see early voting.
And ethics reform and early voting.
A lot of that too. And I think in many instances that is because of what, is the Senate, it's not necessarily, or Senate/IDC in its current form, and not so much the Democratic Assembly. But I don't know if those are things that the governor feels that he can do, sort of piecemeal for the next month or so and riding into his reelection. But if we go back to the conversation about Cynthia Nixon and Stephanie Minor, if they do not get done, those are the things that I think are important pressure points for them as they try to make their case. And just to that, let me just pivot off that just slightly, because you talked about Buffalo, and this is where I think the Stephanie Minor piece comes in, because if you look at Democratic enrollment, it's mostly in the city, so primaries are won in the city. So if you have Cuomo and Nixon battling in the city, and then Cuomo and Minor battling upstate, it actually makes for an interesting dialogue about policies. The governor is very particular about what he does upstate. He hits the mayor in the city, but upstate he takes credit and has received a lot of credit for a lot of the work that he's done upstate. So a lot of the issues that you mentioned do have statewide implications. I think they are more left for some of the activists in the city to sort of take up, but upstate, I don't think they may not resonate as much upstate. Maybe not the voting, except for the voting, but everything else may not resonate as much upstate because they're focused a lot on infrastructure and development, other types of development, and that's where I think a lot of he can take multiple victory laps where Nixon cannot. Minor to some extent. But I see that there's going to be
Minor was Cuomo's chair of the state Democratic Party.
And to be honest, a lot of activists within the state party structure, a lot of the county chairs may not necessarily support an alternative to Cuomo. But if they were going to, it would be Minor and not Nixon. Mm-hmm.
Nixon is not a creation of the party in any way. I mean, my kids went to school with one of, my younger daughter went to school with one of her daughters. I mean, I know that she's a smart education activist.
She is.
We were involved in some fights with her.
Right.
But it seems clear to me that if Minor is in, that she can't, that Nixon can't stand alone is the "I'm not Cuomo."
Right.
Because
That's
Cuomo is in my mind, is still the 800-pound gorilla, and this is about him.
That's right.
As opposed to whoever is the challenger.
Right. And so the one tool that they both have, if they're both in a race, is at the state convention, which is next month. If I remember correctly, it's he needs 50% of the weighted vote in the room to be the official designee of the party. And if they can find a way to not give that to him, that's a victory in and of itself, which is what we saw
And you
in
have
California
the
with Feinstein.
and you have the Working Families Party conundrum, where De Blasio 4 years ago essentially delivered the Working Families Party nomination to Cuomo against some the Working Families Party has kind of street progressive activists, and then it has more traditional union leaders who are, and so and they were at odds. And the mayor delivered the Working Families Party. Will he be able to do it again?
Well, delivered to who?
Deliver it to the governor. Well, I don't think the mayor will. Will the
Where will they
because
be
it's
against
we're talking about. I don't think we're talking about whether the governor is going to win. I think we're talking about whether he gets embarrassed, and that affects his 2020 ambitions. So I mean, that's my own political read of it.
Yeah, his first objective is to win. So
Is to win in November, yes. Yeah. But I mean, how much of this, Dave? I mean, is this? I mean, we're political junkies, so it's kind of fun to look at. The Working Families Party in particular, because we have this strange system where you can vote on, you can combine. I think we're the only state where you can combine votes in multiple parties for an individual in order to reach a total number. No Republican has been elected forever without the Conservative Party votes.
Right.
You had to add them together to get them to win.
Well, it makes a plain difference in electoral politics. I think all of this does make a huge difference in Andrew Cuomo's calculations for 2020. He's going to be badly damaged if he comes out with a narrower victory than he achieved over Zephyr Teachout. And I think that is the platform. We're all looking at 35 and what can go. Can Nixon bring it a little bit higher? But he needs to get something larger. He wants to be able to campaign nationally as a progressive, but a sober progressive, if you will, who's also willing to be tough on crime, not necessarily talk about liberalization of marijuana laws and other things, even though he's reviewing it now. And this race could shape his capacity to make that argument in profound ways.
Nicole, we talk about Donald Trump and we talk about the federal tax plan and how it's going to, and, I'm surprised at how it affects me. And the governor's tried to come up with this workaround, which didn't seem to go very far.
Well, there's a lot of misperception and confusion about the tax plan.
The federal tax plan.
Yeah, not plan, I guess.
Right, the federal tax policy now, the current
for the
law.
moment at least. Right. Most people in New York State will get a tax cut, but the people who won't get a tax cut, the very wealthy individual income earners and families, they are the people who provide the biggest chunk of tax revenue to the state and the city. If you look at New York City, 40,000 families pay half of the city's $10 billion in income tax. Similar situation at the state, but even more skewed toward the wealthy because the state is more dependent on the income tax than the city is. City has property taxes and sales taxes, a lot of other taxes. So if you take the couple of percentage points of people who are not getting a tax cut and who in fact will see a big tax hike in that they now are paying tens of thousands of dollars a year in state and city income taxes that they can't deduct from their federal taxes, there's a real risk that this will spur them to change their behavior, that if they've got a house in Florida, they'll make sure to spend more than half of the year down at that house in Florida. In
order to qualify for residency and no income
you're
tax.
not paying city income taxes on all of the income you make, particularly from investments. And so if we just lost a couple hundred or more, a little bit more than that of our wealthy taxpayers, it puts a big hole in the city and state budgets. For now, city and state budgets are actually doing well because of the tax law, because people wanted to avoid the hit this year, so they prepaid their taxes last year. And the state has an 11% surge in tax revenue that they weren't expecting. But next year, are people going to say, I've just had it, you know, it would be one thing if I was paying all these taxes and we had wonderful subways and wonderful schools and everything else, but the quality of life is just a lot better in Florida or South Carolina for the amount of money that I'm paying. We don't know how people will behave because we've never had this happen before, but it's something that the state and city government need to be thinking about, that suddenly you've increased the burden of the state and local taxes by 40% if you're in the top tax bracket. Another big...
And you've also threatened to lower the value of apartments in the city because of the lack of the, so it's going to hit real estate. And we're a fire, finance, insurance, and real estate drives New York City's money.
But I think the bigger problem longer term is, what do places like New York do in a fiscal crisis when historically they've raised taxes and people have put up with these tax hikes? You remember Bloomberg said it's a luxury city, people will pay higher taxes to live in New York. One, it's not as much of a luxury city as it was. When you can't ride the subway, you're stuck in traffic if you're trying to get a car, and so on and so forth. And two, suddenly if you have to raise the state income tax or the city income tax in the next recession, you have to raise it by 40% more than you would have to get the same amount of money that you would have last year.
If you have these richer people.
But New York is not even the worst off, because we do offer something different for the higher taxes. It's Connecticut and New Jersey that are really in a lot of trouble, because there's no, if you're living in Connecticut, you're living in New Jersey, you've got this horrible commute, and you're not getting much compared to what you would get living in Pennsylvania, living in a more southern state. And so people may first move from Connecticut and New Jersey into New York City. If they're saying, I'm paying these higher taxes, I might as well get something for it, or they may leave the region altogether.
The relationship between the federal government, the state, and the city have changed profoundly because of this tax bill.
Because of the tax bill, because of sharing costs for policing terrorism, because of the
but we've been doing that for a long time.
Right, but
there's always added cost to New York for protecting the UN and protecting all the diplomatic stuff we've always had to do.
But
and
making
Trump Tower now.
And they don't pay their parking tickets
with no significant fill-up. But I also think it's worth thinking about trade policy and its effect on the city, and migration policy and its effect on the city. We are a city of immigrants. We thrive on our ability to attract talented people. That's being sharply throttled back all through the regular programs and through special programs like H-1B, which is now extended to months of additional vetting for the people who are coming through that process. The fact that it's going to be harder for a period of time to sell goods and services out of the city abroad, which is enormously important here. We have about a $1.8 trillion regional economy, and about $700 million of that is foreign trade. So there are many, many ways in which federal policy, even if it doesn't seem directly targeted to New York, has a profound influence on what we're able to achieve.
The Trump foibles and the possibility that the president could be facing impeachment, and the possibility that we may get, if you'll pardon the expression, a real right-winger in Pence as president. One of the things that concerns me is I believe Pence really believes what he says, as opposed to, I'm still not sure the president believes anything. How are you looking at the implications of this?
Oh, what, that Trump won't be there?
Yeah.
Who knows? He could do anything any day. It seems, we're taping this several hours after Paul Ryan, who's Republican Speaker of the House, says, I'm not going to come back next
It's a wonderful editorial you all have in the paper tomorrow.
I'm not going to come back after all. And after 3 years, walking away from being Speaker of the House, the likelihood is that the Democrats will make big gains and could take the House and maybe a chance to take the Senate too. Then what happens with Trump? And, I guess they can impeach him for something, give him a trial. I doubt you're going to get 2/3 of the vote in the Senate to remove him, even though he does, does crazy things. But he would be reined in. So he may not want to be reined in, and he says, forget you, I'm going back to New York, and here Mike Pence finish up. And there's a good chance that the Democrats take the House and the Senate, there'll be standoffs with Trump. And Trump may say, you know what, I'm actually a liberal Democrat again, like I was all those years when I lived in New York, and I love immigrants, and I'm pro-choice, and for free trade. So he may just switch and dance with them and some of these hurtful.
Which I don't think Mike Pence would.
Mike Pence would definitely not dance with another man. That's certainly. So things could change, but things in Washington are so insanely crazy because of Trump. Everything he does is just makes no sense, and to count on it. So his attack on the immigrants, with the DACA is now in the courts. Some things are frozen. He says he has a trade deal with the Chinese, or he doesn't. Who knows what else he's going to do? So people are waiting. This is now April. We'll see what happens in November. And Trump may say, okay, I'll modulate my policies. I don't think, maybe they'll have to, change the tax bill, because it came out yesterday. Well, the deficits are going to be $1 trillion gazillion dollars. And the Republicans who say we don't want deficits and debt, they've just created a program which is going to build more deficits and debt than anything has ever been imagined in the history of the Republic. So maybe that will change too. Sorry, I can't predict much.
I don't want to do the, I don't want to get through the show without focusing a little bit more on some of the social justice questions. Especially bail reform, the closing of Rikers, all these things which did not get
back to Albany.
Did not get through Albany. What are the implications? How could you? How could you close Rikers without that?
Well, I look at when I think about implications, I actually think about, and it's something that you mentioned earlier, about the broader sort of impact on civic engagement in the city. We have had record low voter turnout. We have had, and it's across the country. And there's an interesting statistic that I read that 4.4 million Obama voters from 2012 did not come out in 2016. More than a third of them are black. And what I look at is when you talk about bail reform and Rikers, I think if we focus on those young people from the Parkland shooting and how they got out, they brought other folks with them, and they took adults with them. And why is that important? That's important because in 2008, when a lot of adults were not so set on Barack Obama, a lot of young people took their parents and grandparents to go vote for him. And if we do that, if I think that some version of that happens nationally in 2018, nationally, yes, but even locally, around a lot of these social justice issues, that seems to me where there's this tremendous amount of energy.
You also had those, those Parkland students have demonstrated that they understand that there's a white privilege involved in the amount of attention that they drew, and I think we got to get out of the way and let them make mistakes, but let them lead. Yeah. But they have spent time going into Liberty City and Overtown. Right. And when during the march in Washington, they went into inner city schools to kind of engage kids. Their level of awareness is magnificent.
Theirs has been tremendous, and so are the young people here. Mm-hmm. In addition to the fact that, particularly around violence, gun violence, but certainly around bail reform, certainly around prison reform, there have been people and organizations doing this for decades, mm-hmm. and haven't gotten.
But is this a moment?
I do think it's a moment. And
but didn't you think it was a moment? And the state senate said, "Nah."
Not then.
I'm talking about now.
Not around a budget issue, around a civic engagement. Let's get out and hit the pavement, go vote moment. That I think we can see in November. Around the budget, not so much, because there's a different dance there. And don't get me into this idea of, sorry, you didn't, but thinking about the budget, one of the reasons that I don't think it's as small d democratic is because a senior-ranking African-American woman was not allowed in the room during budget negotiation.
Who was the head of the Democratic
Andrea Stewart
caucus.
Cousins, by the
Right.
way. So I'll just say her name. So, which
And
is
is
something
now
I've been-
the head of the Democrat,
and is-
now the
right.
minority leader of the Senate.
But she was not in the room during budget negotiations. So I can understand in part why some of the things that we needed to get done, get on a social justice platform, were not pushed. Maybe she's in the room, they get done, maybe not. But my point is that there are so many conversations now happening around what hasn't been done, what was once opaque, what now is there's a greater push for transparency, and around all of this activism, I do hope that the voters make this case in November.
Bob, you're mixing. I was going to say you're mixing up two things. You're mixing up a genuine grassroots movement, which came from those 17-year-olds, and they had to march in Washington and
March here.
mobilize. And then you're mixing up the sham government we have in Albany, which is fake democracy, where everything is closed. It's a couple people in a room. You know, of course they're not going to have Andrea Stewart Cousins. She's a Democrat. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if she's black or she's a woman. She's out of power. In Albany, you're out of power. You know, get out of town. The way that they disparage the political minorities in Albany, they might as well not even show up. Everything is secret. Everything's done at the last minute. You know, Saturday morning we say, well, what passed, what didn't? Early voting, oh, that died. You know, why? Was there ever a hearing on it? No. Was there ever a committee report on it? No. Was there ever a discussion of it? No. There were theories and rumors. Is this going to be in the budget? Is that not going to be in the budget? So bail reform, they want that. Yeah, until they didn't want it, because everything is cut and dried on a table, and it is the opposite of what we...
Of the passion of the...
Well, and also of the theory that we teach from grade school up, that there's forces and counter forces. You have a hearing, a bill. It's like, nah, they just cut the deal. Everything gets left on or left off, and then we try and, you know, sort through it. So, yes, I think that there is movement going on. There's no movement in Albany on anything, you know, only towards, you know, away from the police coming to arrest them, because generally that's how they leave office, getting arrested. So that you should, it's not a joke, it really happens. You know, the only change happens in Albany is when leaders get hauled off in handcuffs. And don't mix up the idealism of these Parkland students with the corrupt
Well, no, but the essence
of Albany.
is to try to translate. The question is, can you translate? I want to go to questions, but can you translate that activism, which historically has changed the world, whether it's the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement? Is this one
Albany
of those
ain't the world,
movements
though.
in which that street passion gets translated into electoral activism, gets translated into government?
A lot of it
change?
is changing the people that are there. That's
Yes, ma'am. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
or term limits.
Hi all, my name is Gabby Cervantes. I'm from Baruch College, and my question is, do you panelists think that the DREAM Act will pass this year?
How do you galvanize? I mean, people, you know, a lot of movements start from frustration. How do you translate that frustration into something that's more productive? You know, so, I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about.
Should we do something
DREAM Act.
something on the budget, the JMAC?
DREAM Act.
Oh, the DREAM Act, the DREAM Act.
Yes. Well, right now the DREAM Act looks pretty dead in Washington. If we think about President Trump's declaration that DACA's dead, and it doesn't look like we're going to get any positive movement on immigration. But I would say to you and your classmates that there's plenty to be done. Another distinguished Baruch alumna, Cristina Jimenez, is the managing director of United We Dream, and has been terrifically productive, recent MacArthur Fellow, by the way, terrifically productive at galvanizing public opinion. I think one of the things, to go back to the Parkland shooting that we've seen, is a terrific media savvy, remarkable ability to stay on message. But there's also an educational piece, and this is what it is. In that school district, you can't graduate high school without getting a mandatory debate curriculum. We've lost that in our schools by and large, with precious exceptions like that. These are terrific young men and women. I don't want to take anything away from them in that regard, but they're also educated properly, and that's something that we educators
They're also
can take on
incredibly
ourselves.
cyber literate.
Yes, so
That's
incredibly.
which is the really profound.
But
this is a fight that's going on their turf.
But they have been taught to analyze and make representations evidenced arguments about policy. How many of us can say that at secondary school levels today? That needs to get back into curricula, and that would help shape debate. It's a long-term project, but it's worth engaging.
I agree with that, absolutely.
I think where there's a chance for the DREAM Act is after November, because it fits into the general narrative of government incompetence, that as Trump runs for re-election, he can't be seen by his voters to be incompetent, that he said he was going to build a wall, but there's no wall, or he said he's going to protect the country from illegal immigration, but the number of people crossing the border illegally is rising again because the economy is better. But to make progress on better enforcement of immigration laws, whether it's having electronic employer verification of ID that applies to all employers, not just certain ones, have more audits and so forth. In order to get those things done, he needs to resolve the issue of all of the people who are already here and who are not going anywhere. So he has an incentive to do a deal after November, and he has an incentive to do it early so his voters forget that part, and then he campaigns on the fact that he secured the border and started building the wall.
Yes, sir. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
Good evening. John Wilson, York College. NYCHA President Shola Otoye resigned. This is for the panel. Going forward, the type of individual that the NYCHA residents could hope to feel comfortable with. Any thoughts?
Someone who, well, we did not call for her head, as many were. Part of it, she was undercut by de Blasio. She came in early on, and I live across the street from a NYCHA development, you see on Monday morning, there's garbage everywhere. Why? It's not because the people in NYCHA are dirty. It's because garbage in NYCHA is not collected after 3 o'clock on Friday. So everything builds up all day Saturday, all day Sunday, multiplied by 400,000 people, and it's sitting there Monday morning. She said, this is horrible, we have to fix this. In order to fix it, she had to negotiate with the union representing the NYCHA workers. They wanted something, and de Blasio undercut her. Instead of supporting her and supporting the tenants, the people who live there, who don't want garbage on their block every weekend forever, he cut a deal with the labor union representing the workers that they wouldn't have to pick up this garbage until Monday. So maybe she should have resigned then. She should have said, you know, I represent the people and you undercut me. So whoever comes in there now, he has an old hand named Stan Brezhnev. He used to work for Ed Koch. He's had about every job in government you could ever imagine these past 40 years, to say, okay, we're going to do whatever it takes to get the heat on, to get the garbage picked up, to get the repairs made, to get the mold out, to get the lead out. We're not going to lie to the federal government. We're not going to lie to the tenants. And he's going to have to take on the union. He's going to have to take on the builders. He's going to have to take on everyone to fight for the residents. So, you know, good luck to whoever takes that job. And the example was the woman who just had to quit, who tried, and he didn't even support her.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, panelists. My name is Liam Giordano. I currently attend Baruch College. My question is concerning the relationship between the federal government and the state of New York following of course, the gubernatorial elections in November, and of course the midterm elections for the federal government and also in November. Do you believe that there'll be a shift in the communication between New York, specifically New York City, with de Blasio and the federal government following the elections?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, more interestingly, will there be a change, if you don't mind my shifting your question a little bit, assuming Cuomo gets reelected, is there a change in the relationship between the city and the state?
My feeling is that it'll depend on whether or not Democrats take back the House and the Senate. I actually think, you sort of touched on it before, I think the president has a malleable policy position, whereas Pence, to me, has a dangerous one. It's a specific, and from a Democratic standpoint, he's dangerous. But the president he'll basically...
do or say anything.
Depending on who was last in his ear. And if it's a Democrat that's last in his ear, and it's consistently a Democrat that's last in his ear, then maybe you get a little different kind of response from Washington. But I am not a fan of his nominees. We talk about NYCHA. HUD, to me, in many ways, has a very specific sort of what I would even consider a civil rights not mantra, but mission, if you will, because of the kinds of programs that fall under it. And look who's there, right? And so to me, I don't think—
But he has a nice dining room table.
He does have a nice dining room set. Institutionally, I don't think you'll see a whole heck of a lot change because of who he has positioned in leadership in those institutions. But what I look for, again, are two things. If he's spending a lot of time around Democrats, like Schumer and whoever, if we can get, if we can take back the House, if those are the last voices in his ear, then perhaps there's something to
very quickly. I mean, they're talking about the governor and the mayor. The biggest fights were between, Rockefeller and Lindsay, between Pataki and Giuliani, between Cuomo and Koch, now between Cuomo and de Blasio. Same party. In all those cases.
Right. Well,
yes, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Jessica Torres. I currently attend Baruch College. My question
you have a
is—
big Baruch College.
Yeah.
go Baruch.
My question is there a chance for a more united front between Senate Democratic Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins and Assembly Speaker Carl Heastie? And will their unity make it more difficult for the governor to control budget negotiations in the future?
Well, you called her majority leader. And that's her goal. Stewart Cousins is leading the unified Democrats, and likely in about 2 weeks there will be special elections, and they will have most probably 32 elected Democrats, but there's one guy in there who just goes to the highest bidder. So it doesn't seem as though that's going to change until the election. And if the Democrats pick up Republican seats, there's a guy, I think he's 90, Republican from the Hudson Valley, is running. If in this probably good Democratic year, bad Republican year with Trump at the top, Trump
hanging over the Republicans, right?
And they pick up 2 or 3 seats, and you end up with a actual majority, then Cuomo's going to have to deal with her on an equal standing as he deals with Heastie. I don't think he's going to let her sex be a factor. It just,
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Numbers are going to matter. I mean, you.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think and that's where the rubber meets the road, because will they push him more to the left on certain issues? Did we get all the things that we talked about before, or do we start getting that? And how does the governor, think about those things as he's running? Like, does he want to have to deal with it, or does he find a way to sort of work around it again? And if you're in again, I think about this because I had to deal with it so much in 2016. If you're in a post-Bernie environment, sort of how do you position yourself in the electorate in 2020?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good evening. My name is Denise. I'm from the Baruch College School of Public Affairs. And my question is this: does any one of you know whether Governor Cuomo or Mayor Bill de Blasio is addressing the issue of bail reform, where low-income people actually stays in jail because they cannot afford bail?
Who have not been convicted of anything, but they're
Yes.
because they cannot make bail.
Yes,
That's right.
and then when they stay in bail, they cannot afford it, and whether their families can bail them out through some sort of like credit or wage garnishment.
Non-cash bail. I mean, the question
Yes,
is about non-cash bail. It was among many issues. That was, the Child Victims Act in terms of past victims of sexual abuse by priests and by teachers, and there was, could they go back and file suit? The bail reform didn't go anywhere. Some of the sexual harassment issues were addressed. Bail reform,
Ethics reform, campaign finance reform, all in the garbage.
Election, well, I mean, not only campaign finance, but early voting. Obviously, there's an immense agenda of issues that we can't get to, but I think the bail reform is particularly powerful.
And I'm not sure why the governor can't present bail reform as a law and order issue. That one good example is the UFC fighter from Ireland I only mentioned
Right.
I only mentioned that he's from Ireland to point out that he's not a citizen. He's here on a work visa. He doesn't have the right to stay in the country, and he allegedly committed a violent crime
At the
last
Barclays
week.
Center of all places.
And he's out on $50,000 bail, and it's just because he and his financial backers can't afford $50,000. And the judges so far are being very nice to him and letting him keep his passport
Yeah,
because
but the people that
he has
this
to work.
woman is talking about
Right.
can't
Well, that's what I'm
afford
saying.
$500.
They sit in Rikers for years.
This fighter gets to keep his passport because he has to work. Well, he should have thought of that before he allegedly committed a violent
Not sure he
crime.
thought of much
and you
before he
could
did that.
say about anyone who's sitting in Rikers Island who can't come up with $5,000, that person has to work too. I mean, a lot of people lose their jobs, they lose their apartments because they're sitting there, and that it points up the fact that it should be based on danger to the community and potential flight risk. That if there's a credible threat that you are
Well, those are
really
the two standards.
a
for bail,
dangerous
right.
dangerous person, then that should be a factor in your bail. And if you are a flight risk, that should be a factor in your bail. But if you're not, it really shouldn't be a financial question.
You only have
Well, it's
40
worth pointing out
seconds.
that they're dealing with this across the river in New Jersey.
Yes, they are.
And this has been a signature proposal of the new governor, and actually the former governor, Chris Christie, has now done a rare reversal and said, I was wrong about the failure to reform bail. It needs to happen. So they're showing the way. The Empire State needs to catch up.
We need to catch up with a lot of states and a lot of things, particularly early voting. And our low turnout is clearly linked to how hard it is to vote in this state, unnecessarily.
Unnecessarily. And we, one of the things that I got hammered with, is not my fault, but I was ahead of the party, so I got talked through it, is ballot access and voter access. And
Well,
it's key.
I reach zero, and I always make deadline. Thank you all. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.